I stood with my friends in the living room of my apartment, staring at the map of Chippewa National Forest spread out on the coffee table. Who in their right mind goes camping in the dead of winter? I asked, my voice laced with skepticism. "Ah, come on, Jack," Thomas said, shrugging. "It'll be an adventure, and Jason knows the woods. Plus, we'll have all the gear we could possibly need. We'll be fine as long as we've prepared." I couldn't help but feel that Thomas was only doing this trying to impress Jason, who was known for his athleticism and love of the great outdoors. "I agree with Thomas," Jason chimed in right on cue. "I've worked as a fire watcher in the summers during college, and I know how to handle the elements. As long as we've prepared, we'll be fine." Jason was always sure of himself and was a bit of a know-it-all. The only one in our friend group who could outdo him in bragging and ego was Darren. But as big of an ego as Darren had, the woods weren't his thing. Even glamping Tom Haverford style would be slumming it for Darren. Sensing another skirmish in their ongoing war of egos, Darren spoke up. "Yeah, because braving the elements and risking hypothermia is such a great idea," he said. Jason rolled his eyes at this. Despite Darren's seeming opposition to the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that Darren was secretly excited about the idea of the trip. He was probably only against it because Jason was on board. Sam, the only girl in the group, raised an eyebrow. "I don't know, guys. I'm not sure if it's a good idea to go camping. I mean, it's going to be the middle of January. What if we get stuck out there in a blizzard?" Sam, as usual, was the voice of reason. Now, Sam was a skilled hiker. She had gone camping on many occasions in just the few years that I had known her. So the idea that she was skeptical of the idea made me feel a little more confident in my position. Matt looked up from his phone and nodded in agreement with Sam. "I agree with her. We should probably wait and go when the weather is better. Maybe this summer. You know, like normal, sane people do." Matt was a big guy who had played football in high school, but that was almost a decade ago. And now he was getting to be slightly out of shape, and he was not a seasoned hiker or a camper. Sports, not trudging through the wilderness, were his passion. "But you know me, guys. I'll do whatever the group decides," Matt said. Sam cut a sharp, disapproving look at him. I glanced around at my friends. Thomas and Jason were for going and were excited about the prospect of braving the elements. Sam and Darren were against the trip, or at least they were hesitant about it. Matt, as usual, was plopped right on the fence trying to not upset anyone. Which meant that, in the end, it was going to be up to me to cast the deciding vote. Great. After a moment of contemplation, I reluctantly agreed to go on the trip. "Fine," I said with a sigh. "But we'll have to be extra careful and make sure that we're prepared for anything." And with that, our winter camping adventure was set. And we set off down a path that I could not have imagined in my worst nightmare. But for now, we all sat there blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited us in the snowy wilderness. Over the next few weeks, we prepared for the trip, gathering gear and supplies. Jason and Sam did most of the planning of the specifics of the trip. We spent many evenings coming up with ideas about what we could do deep in the woods in the middle of January. Sam mentioned that there was a waterfall near one of the campsites. She had visited it a few years back and thought it might be cool to see it in the winter. So this was added to our itinerary. Really, that was about it. The main goal of this trip for Jason, and by extension Thomas, was to test themselves against Old Man Winter. The rest of us were really just going along for the ride, hoping that it would be a fun time with friends. You know, something we could look back on when we were old and laugh about how dumb we were as youngsters. But through all the planning and preparation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this trip. But I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. All I knew was that deep down I felt that this was a bad idea. And it wasn't just the winter weather that was bothering me, it was something else. I convinced myself that it was crazy, that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. Jason and Darren and Sam were planning this out like a military operation. Jason, who had the most experience with camping, helped us to make a list of everything that we needed. We stocked up on warm clothing, sleeping bags, food, and other essentials. We would be fine. It was all just my nerves. As the day of our trip grew closer, I began to feel that we were all a bit on edge. The forecast for the second day of our trip was looking worse and worse. There was now a winter storm expected to hit the entire region. It wasn't supposed to be too bad though, so we were still determined to go through with our plans, no matter what the weather had in store for us. Besides, we had planned and prepared too much by then, and the sunk cost fallacy was in full swing. On the night before the trip, we all gathered at my apartment to have one last hangout before we set off on our adventure. We packed our bags and checked and rechecked our supplies and went over the plans again. We finished up quickly and sat around in my living room waiting to see the weather at 11. After all the normal news and ads, the weather forecast finally came on the TV. The storm had sped up and grown stronger. It was now set to hit in full force on the second day of our trip, bringing heavy snow and strong winds. Jason seemed almost gleeful about it. The rest of us tried to quell our unease. The others seemed to be more successful, and they slowly started echoing Jason's bravado. All I felt was the dread growing stronger. It wasn't just the weather that was making me uneasy. There was a sense of unease that seemed to hang over the trip, like a thick cloud blocking the sun. But despite my reservations, I knew that there was no backing out now. We were all in this together, and we would have to see it through to the end, no matter what lay ahead. The next morning, we loaded up Matt's truck and Sam's car, and we drove off to the forest. A small convoy of idiots headed into an icy hell. After a few hours of driving, we reached the forest. We followed the signs and found the parking lot nearest the trail leading to our chosen campsite. After unloading our gear and stretching a bit, we set off down the trail towards the campsite. The ominous clouds overhead were a constant reminder of the storm that was coming. There was a nervous energy that seemed to pulse through us all. We chatted and we joked as we hiked. I joined in, trying to hide my unease, just trying to make the best of the trip. Trying to distract myself from the looming sense of danger that seemed to lurk just out of sight. We reached the campsite after about 40 minutes of hiking. After the first few minutes of the hike, I found myself almost relaxing, feeling a little bit lighter and enjoying the company of my friends. Despite the snowstorm that was approaching, we were all in high spirits, eager to set up camp and get settled in for the night. As we unpacked our gear and started setting up camp, Jason and Sam led out on this since they were the only ones who had anything remotely describable as experience. Matt and Thomas tried to get the fire going, but after failing at it for about 20 minutes, they finally asked Jason for help. With the fire going and the camp set up, we started working on dinner. We were marginally successful at getting something good to eat going, and we eventually gathered around the fire. Darren had brought his guitar, and we sang a few campfire songs. As the night drew on, the crisp air started to turn icy. It was the first real sign of what was in store for us, and the fire struggled to fight back the cold. After a few more hours of staying near the fire, the party atmosphere was beginning to wane, and everyone seemed to be getting ready to start settling into their respective tents for the night. That's when we heard a noise on the trail just outside of our camp. A flashlight beam appeared, and we saw the silhouette of a man approaching. As the figure entered camp, the firelight revealed that it was a park ranger. "Are you folks aware that there's a blizzard coming?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. "It's not safe to camp during a storm, especially one as big as this one's gonna be." We all nodded, telling him that we were well aware of the storm. "It's just a little snow," Jason told him. "We're prepared for it." But the ranger shook his head, his expression grave. "This isn't just any storm," he said. "It's a big one, and storms like this, they can bring things with them more than just snow. There are dangers in these woods that you don't want to mess with. Dangers brought out by nature, especially in a storm like this." Jason, who considered himself an expert outdoorsman, laughed at the ranger's warning. "We can handle any animals that come our way," he said confidently. But the ranger just shook his head. "There are things in this woods that are older than the animals. Things almost as Old Man Winter himself. Things from an ancient long ago time. Things that are a great evil." Darren laughed at the ranger's words. "Dude, really?" he said, his tone derisive. "You may think it's all a joke now," the ranger said, his voice low and stern. "But you'll soon see the truth of what I'm saying. I'm warning you to be very careful out here. You have been warned." Darren and Jason seemed amused by the ranger's words, but I felt my dread return, and a sense of unease seemed to settle over the rest of the group too. The ranger's words had struck a chord, and we couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something that we didn't. After a few more minutes of trying to convince us to leave, the ranger said his goodbyes and wished us luck. An almost sad look settled on his face as he turned to leave, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. We sat in silence, the gravity of his words weighing heavily on us. Some of us tried to brush it off and have fun for a little while longer, but the mood had been dampened. Jason said that we should go and check out the waterfall in the morning while the weather was still good. The rest of the group cheered up at this and started asking Sam about the trail that led there. I stared into the fire. Despite their enthusiasm, I couldn't shake the feeling that we should stay put and just ride out the storm and then get out of here. Eventually, the conversation died off, and one by one, we retired to our tents for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing as I listened for any sign of danger. I could see a faint light through the tent wall. Deciding that the others must have woken up too, I got up and left my tent. Outside, I found Sam and Jason looking out into the woods, concerned looks on their faces. As I reached them, there was a sound almost like a rattle in the distance. "What is that?" I whispered to the others, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Sam replied, her eyes wide with fear. It woke us up a few minutes ago. It sounded like it was right outside the tents." We looked at each other nervously in the dim light of the fire. "It's probably just an animal," Jason said, trying to sound reassuring, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. The sounds of chittering filled the cold night air. We stood listening as the noise grew louder and more insistent. It was clear that whatever was causing the sound was getting closer, and we had to do something. Let's add more fuel to the fire," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It might keep whatever it is away." Sam and Jason agreed, and we built the fire back up. It was now larger than it had been all evening. We kept looking towards the edge of the camp, expecting something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. The noises continued, but slowly seemed to get fainter, as if whatever was making the noises was moving away from us now. We sat down, each of us staring into the flames. Slowly, we all began to calm down. The strange noises had almost stopped and were now very faint. We grew sleepy again, lulled into a false sense of security by the warmth of the fire. "Okay, the fire will keep whatever it is away. And I'll stay up a while longer and keep a lookout. Just to be safe, okay?" Jason said. "Y'all go back to sleep. It's nothing. Like I said earlier, it's just an animal." We all glanced towards the camp's perimeter as a howl echoed through the trees. Sam and I exchanged worried glances before heading back to our tents. As I laid back down, I wished that we hadn't come on this trip. We had no idea what was causing the noise. But I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too strange, too otherworldly to be anything that belonged in the woods, anything that belonged in this world. I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with the sounds that we had heard. I wound up just praying for the dawn to come. I felt that whatever was out there in the darkness was still lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. The next morning, we woke up to a gloomy, overcast sky. The storm had not yet arrived, but it was clear that it wouldn't be long now. We quickly ate breakfast, eager to get moving and to explore the forest before the blizzard hit. We set out down the trail. Sam commented on how the trail wasn't as well maintained as when she had been here before. At several points, there were fallen trees blocking the path, and the ground was slippery and treacherous underfoot. But we persevered, determined to see the sights and make the most of our time in Mother Nature. Finally, after what felt like hours of hiking, we reached the waterfall. It was a sight to behold, a sparkling cascade of water tumbling down a rock cliff face. We stood in awe, taking in the beauty of the natural wonder. After a break to rest and enjoy the view, we decided that it was time to head back to camp. We knew the storm was getting closer, and we wanted to be back at camp when it hit. So we started retracing our steps, carefully making our way back along the trail. As we made our way back down the trail towards camp, Thomas noticed that there was a trail that led away from the main trail. It seemed old and overgrown, but it still seemed to be going in the general direction of our camp. "Hey guys, check this out," he said, pointing to the trail. "It looks like it might be easier than the trail that we used on the way to the falls. What do you think?" After a brief discussion, we decided to try it. It was still early, and we could always come back and use the main trail if it didn't work out. Plus, who knew what we might find? We made our way down the narrow, winding path, pushing aside branches and vines as we went. It was easier than the other trail, with none of the fallen trees or rocky terrain that we had encountered before, although the path was very overgrown and seemed to have not been used for years. After a while, Sam said, I don't know about this. It's kind of creepy." She looked around nervously. "It feels like we're the first people to set foot on this trail in ages." "Yeah, it's definitely not well traveled," Jason agreed. "But it's kind of exciting, don't you think? Like we're exploring uncharted territory." So we continued on. The trees seemed to loom over us, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder and the sky darker. The storm was getting closer. It wouldn't be too long before it arrived. After about 20 minutes, Matt was starting to get worried and said, "I don't know, guys. It feels like this trail is leading us away from camp, not towards it. Maybe we should turn back." But Jason was now determined to see where the trail would lead. "Come on, Matt, we've come this far. Let's just go a little further and see what we find." We went on, the tension growing as Matt continued to voice his concerns. Just as most of the group was starting to agree with him that we should turn back, we rounded a bend in the trail and emerged into a clearing. Before us sat an old, dilapidated cabin. As we approached the cabin, it became clear that it had been abandoned for a long time. The windows were covered in cobwebs, but they were intact. The roof was overgrown with moss and vines. Despite its dilapidated appearance, the cabin seemed to be structurally sound. "Whoa, check it out," Darren exclaimed, heading towards the cabin door. "This place looks like it hasn't been used in years. Let's go inside and see what's in there." Thomas hesitated. "I don't know, man. What if someone lives here? We don't want to intrude." Darren laughed. "Don't be an idiot, Thomas. No one's lived here in ages. We'll just take a quick look and then we'll leave." Jason followed Darren, saying, "Come on, it's just an old cabin. There's nothing to be afraid of." Darren pushed open the door, and Jason followed him inside. I glanced at Sam, who hesitated and then went in. I guessed that we were doing this, and I stepped onto the porch and crossed the threshold into the cabin. The cabin was small, with a creaky wood floor and rough-hewn walls. The inside was just as old and decrepit as the outside. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the room, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. The air inside felt thick and heavy, as if it had been undisturbed for years. There was a fireplace in one corner, long since gone cold, and a crude wooden table at one end of the main room. There was an odd symbol carved into the floor, one that I had never seen before. Something about it seemed ancient and otherworldly. The strange symbol caught my attention. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach as I looked at it. There was a deer head mounted on one of the walls. Its face had been caved in, leaving only the antlers fully intact. "What happened here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like someone had a party and forgot to invite us," Darren chuckled, poking at the broken deer head with his finger. "I don't think it's funny," Sam said, her voice laced with concern. "We shouldn't be here. This place gives me the creeps." Thomas nodded in agreement. "I agree. Let's get out of here before something happens." "Whoa, what's this?" Jason said, pointing to the symbol carved into the floor. It was a strange, intricate design that seemed to depict a deer with antlers. "I don't know," I said, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "But it's definitely not something you see every day." "Yeah, it's creepy," Sam said, her voice laced with unease. "I don't like it. Let's get out of here." "Hold on," Darren said, a glint in his eyes. "I want to check out the rest of this place. There's got to be more to see." Jason agreed, undeterred by the eerie atmosphere of the cabin. "Come on, guys. This is an adventure we should explore. Let's see what we can find." Despite my reservations, I followed Jason and Darren as they moved deeper into the cabin. Jason headed into a hall that led off from the main room. I looked back, noticing Sam venturing into the kitchen area. Matt opened up a drawer by the sink, then tried the faucet, finding that it didn't work. Darren wandered off to explore the back of the cabin, and I saw him go through a door. I followed Jason down the hallway and into a room. It was a bedroom. He laid down on the bed and pretended to go to sleep. I rolled my eyes as he pretended to snore. Suddenly, one of the legs of the bed gave way and the thing collapsed. Jason lay on the broken bed, laughing. I sighed and went back out into the main room. As I stood there, the air in the cabin felt thick and oppressive, as if it were holding on to a long-buried secret. The deer head and the carving and all the old, dilapidated furniture gave the cabin such an eerie atmosphere. The others had all gone to the bedroom to see what Jason was doing. Everyone but Darren. He must still be in the back room that I had seen him go into earlier. I pushed open the closed door and went in, curious to see what he had found. The back room was small and cramped, filled with old boxes and broken furniture. As I entered the room, I saw Darren standing by a dresser. The dresser was covered in candles like it was some sort of shrine. There was a box in the center of the candles that was oddly free of the dust and cobwebs that coated everything else. As I approached, I noticed that Darren had a strange object in his hand. He was staring at it intensely. It was a small doll made of twigs and twine. It was primitive. The oddest thing was that it had twigs branching out from either side of its head like antlers. I remembered the carving and the deer head, and a shiver went down my spine again. Darren still had not reacted to my presence. I reached out and I put a hand on his shoulder. Darren, you okay, bud?" I asked. He still didn't react. I was beginning to get concerned. "What are you guys doing?" Sam said. I jumped and looked back to see her and the others enter the small room. Sam noticed Darren and what was in his hand. "What is that thing?" she asked, her voice laced with disgust. When Darren didn't answer, she grabbed his shoulder and shook him. At this, he finally looked away from the doll. I have no idea," Darren replied blankly. Sam looked at the doll, her eyes showing a trace of fear. "Darren, put that thing down. There's something not right about it," she said. "It's seriously creepy." She shivered as she said this. "I feel like we're disturbing something here that we shouldn't be. In fact, this whole place is wrong. Let's get out of here." Thomas quickly agreed and was already backing towards the door. Yeah, guys, we should get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps." Darren set the doll back on the shrine, but he still seemed entranced by the strange thing. As Sam and Matt followed Thomas out of the cabin, Jason looked at Darren and then at the doll and the shrine. "Yeah," he said slowly. "We should go." He quickly headed out the door. I followed Jason. As I reached the door, I paused and looked back towards Darren, not wanting to leave him alone in the creepy cabin. His eyes were once again fixed on the doll, his hand slowly reaching towards it. His fingers hovered over it as if he couldn't resist the urge to touch it. Suddenly, he reached down and grabbed the doll, shoving it quickly into his coat pocket. An odd smile flickered across his face. Slightly disturbed by this, I quickly headed out of the cabin, not wanting Darren to know that I had seen him take the doll. As I joined the group, Jason said, "Well, that was cool, but this seems to be where the trail ended. Let's head back to the main trail. If we hurry, we can make it before nightfall and before the storm." We all agreed. Darren finally joined us outside, and we headed back down the trail, now walking a bit faster. After going down the trail for a while, I noticed that Darren was lagging behind. I turned around and called back and yelled, "Hey, Darren, you okay?" He didn't respond. "Come on, man," I said, trying to gently persuade him to move faster. "We need to get back to camp. It's getting cold out here, and the storm is gonna start hitting soon." Darren looked up from the trail and stared at me blankly. He slowly nodded his head and started walking a bit faster. Eventually, we reached the main trail, and as we headed back towards camp, I noticed a snowflake slowly fall and land on my nose. We eventually made our way back to the campsite. The storm seemed to be finally arriving. The flurries that had begun earlier had steadily increased, making the trail back from the waterfall even harder to hike. The mood of the group seemed to have been spoiled by what had happened at the cabin. "We need to gather extra firewood," I said as we approached the campsite. "Yeah, you guys do that and I'll start cooking supper," Matt offered, heading towards the cooking area. After about 20 minutes, we had added a fairly large amount of firewood to our supply. "Well, I think we have enough firewood," Jason said, surveying the pile. "Let's rest until dinner." We all sat down by the fire, and a few minutes later, Matt called out that supper was ready. As we ate, we discussed the storm and how the conditions were rapidly worsening. "Do you think we should head out? We could make it back to the cars and head home before the storm is too bad," I asked as I looked up at the sky. "Nonsense," Jason replied, his voice loud and confident. "This is where the real challenge begins. We've got enough firewood and supplies to last the night. Plus, it's already too late to leave. It would be more dangerous than staying here." We finished up dinner, then Matt pulled out the guitar and started playing. The music and the fire were nice, and despite the worry about the storm, we started enjoying ourselves. Everyone except Darren, that is. Darren was quiet and still, staring into the fire. He hadn't said anything since we had left the cabin. He had helped with the camp chores and even eaten a few bites of food, but mostly he just sat there gazing into the fire. He had kept his hand constantly in the pocket of his jacket, the same pocket I had seen him put the creepy doll into. His eyes seemed to darken and circles were forming under them. His skin seemed to look pale in the firelight. I wondered if it was all just the light playing tricks on me, or if the events of the day had really taken such a toll on him. I tried to focus back on the conversations around me. After a few more minutes, Sam pointed out that the snow was starting to intensify. "It looks like the blizzard's here," she said. We should probably turn in for the night." We all agreed, and Jason volunteered to stay up and keep an eye on the fire for a while. Thomas offered to take over the watch later in the night so Jason could get some sleep. And with that, we all headed off to our tents. I woke up to the sound of the storm raging outside my tent. I still felt tired despite having slept soundly. I unzipped my tent and I stepped out, only to be met with a wall of cold white flakes. My breath was visible in the air and I could feel the chill down to my bones. The wind howled through the trees and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes. The storm had worsened significantly since we had gone to bed. The snow was now piling up and there were icicles forming on the trees. Visibility was almost non-existent. The rest of the group was starting to stir, and that's when I realized that the fire had gone out. That was strange. Thomas was supposed to have kept the fire going. I walked over to Thomas's tent just as he was getting out of it. Over the wind, I yelled, "Thomas, what happened to the fire?" Thomas groggily rubbed his eyes and looked at the dead fire pit. "I don't know. Darren said that he would watch it." The rest of the group had now gathered, and Jason asked, "What? When did Darren say that? It was your job when you took over from me." Thomas told us that Darren had approached him about an hour into his watch, saying that he couldn't sleep and that he would take over the watch. "I figured that if he was gonna be awake anyway, I might as well get some sleep," Thomas said sheepishly. I frowned, feeling a sense of unease wash over me. "Where is Darren?" I asked, looking around. "He's not here." Thomas's eyes widened. "Look, I haven't seen him since he relieved me. I'm a deep sleeper and he was supposed to watch the fire. It's not my fault." Okay, Sam said. "What's done is done, but where is Darren?" Maybe he just went to the bathroom or something," I said, hoping that I was right. Sam looked at me ominously and said, "Thomas, you go and get the fire back going. Otherwise we'll freeze. We will search the campsite, okay?" We all agreed and started the search of the immediate area. It quickly became clear that Darren was not here. He had vanished into the storm. We gathered around the fire, trying to come up with a plan. The wind was howling so loudly that we could barely hear each other speak. "We have to find him. He could be hurt or lost out there," Sam said. Jason nodded. "I'll go look for him," he said, his voice grim. "I know these woods better than anyone. I'll be able to find him." "No," I said. "The storm's too strong. We don't need you getting lost too." "Well, we can't just leave him out there. Now can we, Jack?" Jason screamed over the wind. "Of course not," I said. "But no one needs to go out there alone." "Okay, me and Jack will go out west and circle around," Sam said. "You guys go east and circle around that way." Okay, great plan. Let's go, Matt," Jason said. "Thomas, you stay here and keep an eye on the fire. We don't want it going out again." We quickly grabbed our flashlights and we headed out into the storm. The snow was coming down harder now, and it was difficult to see more than a few feet in front of us. "Darren!" I shouted out into the darkness. "Where are you, man?" There was no answer. We trudged on, calling out his name, shining our flashlights around, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. "Where could he have gone?" Sam asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know," I replied, starting to get worried. But we have to find him. He can't last long in this weather." We searched for what felt like hours, but it was no use. There was no sign of Darren anywhere. Eventually, Sam and I were forced to turn back, cold and wet and worried about our missing friend. When we got back to the campsite, we found Jason, Matt, and Thomas sitting close to the fire. "You didn't find him?" Jason asked. "No, we didn't see a trace," I said. "Us either," Jason said. "What do we do?" Thomas asked. "We need to go back to the cars. If we can get there, then to the ranger's station, we'll be able to get help," Sam said. "They're not going to search in the storm," Thomas said. "No, but they'll start as soon as it's over, and they'll have more manpower. We aren't going to find him alone, and the sooner that a proper search and rescue operation starts, the more likely we'll find him alive," Sam said. Jason nodded in agreement. "Leaving the camp in this storm is dangerous, but it's the best thing that we can do to help Darren. We'll be all right if we're careful and if we hurry," he said. And with that, it was decided. We quickly gathered our belongings and left the campsite, heading down the trail towards the parking lot. The storm was fierce now, the winds whipping through the trees and the snow falling so thickly that it was difficult to see more than a few feet in front of us. As we rushed down the trail, our thoughts focused on finding help for our missing friend. Then a sudden shout from Jason made us stop in our tracks. "Hey, I think I saw someone over there," he yelled, pointing off to the side of the trail. "I'm going to go check it out," he said. Matt nodded. "I'm coming with you," he yelled. I peered in the direction that he had pointed and saw nothing. "We don't know what's out there. How do you know it's Darren?" Thomas said, his voice filled with concern. But Jason and Matt were already headed towards the trees, determined to find Darren. Sam, Thomas, and I looked at each other, unsure of what to do. "What do we do?" Thomas asked in a worried tone. "We stick to the plan. We go to the ranger's station and get help. If Jason and Matt find Darren, then they'll catch up," I said firmly. "Now, we can't waste any more time. Whatever Jason saw might not even be Darren." Sam nodded in agreement and silently turned and began trudging down the trail, her head bent against the wind. Thomas and I followed close behind. The storm raged on around us, the snow coming down in thick sheets. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled into my stomach. Where was Darren? Had he gotten lost in the storm? Had he been injured? Or was there something more sinister at play? And what if something happened to Jason and Matt? I pushed the thoughts out of my head and I focused on the trail ahead. But as we stumbled through the storm, I couldn't help but fear the worst. Something about Darren's behavior yesterday and now his sudden disappearance just didn't feel right. We walked on for a minute or two. The storm continued to rage on. Thomas suddenly asked, Are you sure we shouldn't go back? What if Jason and Matt need our help? What if they find Darren and he's injured? We should search for him. I don't like leaving him like this." Sam shook her head, her long blonde hair whipping around her face in the wind. "We've been over this. We weren't going to find him in this storm, and who knows what Jason saw. Did you see anything? I certainly didn't," she said. "The Rangers are our best option now. They have the training and the equipment to find Darren." She turned and stormed down the trail. I followed closely. Thomas paused and looked back, then rushed to follow me. We continued down the trail for about 30 yards. Suddenly, we heard a loud, animalistic scream, followed by the most horrible screams I had ever heard. The sounds made my blood run cold. The screams and roars were coming from the direction Matt and Jason had headed. Sam immediately turned back, her face determined. "That's Jason and Matt," she said. "We have to help them." I reached out and grabbed her arm, trying to stop her. "No, like you just said, we need the Rangers," I said urgently. "They're the ones who can really help. We can't take on whatever's out there on our own," I said. But Sam shook off my grasp and took off running back towards the screams. "I'm not leaving them to face whatever that is alone," she yelled over her shoulder as she disappeared into the storm. "Wait!" Thomas screamed, but it was too late. Sam had already disappeared into the storm. I could hear her shouting for Jason and Matt, her voice barely audible over the howling wind and the terrifying sounds coming from deeper into the woods. Thomas and I exchanged a worried look, both of us barely keeping the panic at bay. We have to help them," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," Thomas replied, his face pale. "But whatever made those noises, it's not human." We ran as fast as we could through the storm. The sounds of the screams and roars grew louder, filling me with a sense of dread. Between Sam's head start and her being in much better shape than we were, and her hiking experience, we quickly lost sight of her. We pushed ourselves to catch up, panting and gasping for air as we stumbled through the snow, following her trail in the snow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. I saw Sam bent over something. As we got closer, I realized with horror that it was Matt. He was lying there, still and lifeless. The snow around him was red with blood. Looking closer, he had a number of wounds, bites and scratches that looked like they had been done by claws. But the worst injury seemed to be to his throat. It had been torn out. Thomas panicked, shouting that we needed to go. Sam argued that we had to help Jason, and as she spoke, we heard a scream and a cry for help. Sam immediately ran towards the sound, following the tracks that led away from Matt. There were two sets of tracks, one clearly human, Jason's. Something about the other set of tracks was strange and unsettling. They seemed to be made by something on two legs, but here and there they would change, seeming to be made by something walking on four legs. The further we went, the more frenzied the tracks seemed to become, as if whatever was making them was getting more agitated. On a few occasions, the tracks seemed to jump from the ground to the trees, or something like that. There were large gaps in them, whatever it was doing. It was as if whatever was making them was running on the ground and then leaping up into the branches. Suddenly, we heard another scream, this one louder and more pained than the last one. It was Jason. We broke into a sprint, fear driving us forward as we followed the tracks, finally breaking into another clearing. The sight that greeted us was something straight out of a nightmare. Jason was huddled on the ground, his face contorted in pain and fear. Over him loomed a creature like nothing I had ever seen before. It was tall and gaunt, its skin a grayish complexion. Its arms seemed longer than a human's. As we got closer, we saw the figure's face, and I realized with shock that the figure was Darren. His eyes were sunken and ringed with dark circles. They now glowed red in the dim light of the storm. His mouth was stained with blood. His legs were oddly deformed. And most disturbingly, what could only be described as antlers were beginning to protrude from the top of his head. I thought back to yesterday and the abandoned cabin and the doll that Darren had found. I thought of his odd reaction to it, and then I remembered its antlers. As we watched in shocked horror, the monster lunged at Jason again, its claws slashing through the air as it tried to tear him apart. It grabbed Jason, its claws tearing into Jason's torso. It viciously lifted Jason and threw him down a nearby embankment. Jason's body rolled down it before slamming into a tree where it stopped unmoving. Sam grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it at the monster's head. It caught it and broke it with its deformed claw-like hands. The creature grabbed Sam by the neck and lifted her. She fought, kicking it multiple times. The monster seemed not to notice. It cocked its head to the side, laughing. It grinned, exposing that its mouth was filled with sharp teeth. The monster then said something in a language and a voice that I didn't recognize. It raised Sam's body higher, screaming in a horrible voice something that reminded me of a chant. It squeezed Sam's neck and she continued to fight, trying to get the monster to release her. Suddenly, there was a sickening cracking sound and Sam's body went limp. Thomas screamed and cried as the monster dropped Sam's body and charged towards him. Thomas was frozen with fear, but eventually he started running. The monster's roars echoed through the forest. My legs pumped as fast as they could go, but the snow, ice, and the undergrowth made it difficult to move quickly. I could hear Thomas panting and sobbing behind me, his fear and desperation fueling his run. As I ran, I frantically searched my mind for a way out of this nightmare. My mind raced with ideas, trying to come up with a plan to save us both. But the monster was too fast, and it was gaining on us with each passing second. I could hear it roaring and screaming in that odd language. I knew that it was only a matter of time before it caught us. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breaths came out in short, ragged gasps. I knew that we were running for our lives, and if we didn't find a way to escape, we were as good as dead. I could hear Thomas panting and struggling to keep up behind me. Suddenly, there was a loud, blood-curdling scream from Thomas. My heart raced as I forced myself to keep running, not daring to look back. I heard the sounds of fighting, screams and roars, and then another chant, the wet tearing of flesh, and all of a sudden, it went quiet again. It was a sound that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my days, however short that might be. But I still didn't dare to look back. I had to make it to the Rangers. I had to survive. The blizzard raged on, the snowfall becoming heavier and heavier as I raced forward towards the trail. My mind was consumed with one thought: escape. The wind howled past my ears as I ran, each step sinking into the deep snow. My legs burned as I ran, desperation fueling my every step. I couldn't let the monster catch me. The trail came into view and I let out a cry of relief. I was almost there. I could see it, the trail. And then, just a little further, the parking lot and the safety of the car, and then the ranger station. I could hear the monster behind me, its snarling and growling becoming more frenzied as it closed in. I finally reached the trail. My heart raced as I pushed myself to run faster, my legs burning with exhaustion. I could feel the daring monster's presence behind me. I could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the ground, its legs pounding against the frozen earth. It was getting closer, and I knew that I couldn't outrun it forever. I heard it scream, and I risked a glance back. I saw the monster, its eyes dark and soulless. It leaped from the trail to a tree. Then it took a flying leap at me, its claws extended, its teeth bared. I managed to duck just in time. The monster flew over me and slammed into a snowbank. I quickly got to my feet and I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the monster roar with frustration behind me. I raced down the trail, my feet pounding against the icy ground, hoping and praying that I would reach the safety of the parking lot before the monster caught up with me. I rounded a bend in the trail. I could see the trailhead and the parking lot beyond. I was almost to safety. My heart was racing with excitement and relief, knowing that I was so close. I pushed my body as hard as I could, summoning the last of my strength and speed. Then, I tripped on a tree root and fell to the ground, sliding across the icy gravel. I looked back down the trail and I saw the monster racing towards me, its twisted, mutated body getting closer and closer with every leaping step. This was it, I thought to myself. The end. I closed my eyes and hoped that it would be quick. Suddenly, I heard a gunshot. I looked back down the trail in the direction of the parking lot. The park ranger that we had met the first night was firing at the monster while running towards me. I scrambled to my feet and ran towards him, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you," I managed to croak out as I reached him. The ranger nodded gravely, his face set in a determined expression. "Come on," he said, taking me by the arm. "We have to get out of here. This isn't over yet." I followed the ranger as he led towards the parking lot, his gun at the ready. As we ran, I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder, afraid that I would see the monster once again in pursuit. The monster was nowhere to be seen. Relief washed over me. I was almost out of these woods. We ran towards the trail's entrance. Beyond, I could see the ranger's truck running, its lights illuminating the swirling snow. Then, in a blur, the monster crashed through the brush from the side of the trail and slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. The monster turned quickly towards the ranger, and with a howl, it charged him. Confusingly, instead of raising his gun to defend himself, the ranger calmly reached into his shirt and pulled out a necklace. The necklace seemed old, some sort of ancient talisman. Its design was not like anything that I had ever seen, an old design created with a weird geometry that seemed to shift and change before my eyes. The ranger held it up in front of the monster, which froze in place and let out a blood-curdling scream. Reacting almost as if it had been physically injured, it scrambled backwards, tripping and falling to the ground. It scurried and crawled as it tried to escape. Eventually, it managed to find its footing and it raced away on all fours. The ranger watched as it disappeared down the trail, being swallowed by the darkness and the storm. Its screams echoed hauntingly through the woods. I was in shock, lying on the ground and staring in disbelief at what I had just witnessed. The ranger came over and reached out his hand to help me to my feet, his face grim. He turned and headed towards his truck. I stumbled after him, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. The ranger led me towards his Jeep with the National Park Service logo emblazoned on the side, its headlights piercing the darkness of the blizzard. He quickly opened the door and gestured for me to get in. My body was shaking as I climbed into the passenger seat. The ranger climbed into the driver's seat. He quickly threw it into gear and the Jeep's tires spun in the deep snow as he navigated the parking lot and then headed down the road. As we drove towards the ranger station, I stared out the window at the forest. "What was that thing?" I asked quietly. "It has many names," he replied. "It dwells in the deepest parts of the forest, where few ever go." I waited for him to say more. Finally, the ranger turned and said, "You know, no one is going to believe what you saw. It's best to keep it to yourself. Tell a different version of events. Believe me, there are some things that the modern world can't handle or understand." We arrived at the ranger station a few minutes later, the tires of the truck crunching over the snowy gravel. The ranger quickly rushed me inside, his face set in a grim expression. He spoke to the two other rangers on duty, both of whom looked grave and concerned. They came over and asked me questions, but I was in shock and I couldn't seem to form coherent answers. Finally, the ranger who had saved my life stepped in and told them a story, saying that I had said on the ride back something about wolves attacking us and getting lost in the storm. It obviously wasn't the truth, but I didn't protest. The other rangers nodded and set to work organizing a search and rescue mission for the rest of my friends. Later that night, the storm began to dissipate, and the search and rescue teams set out into the woods. I knew what they would find. The bodies of the others were found, all killed by the monster that had once been Darren. The Park Service went with the story that the ranger had concocted and said that they had been killed by wolves or had died from injuries they got while lost in the storm. Darren was the only one never found. As I sit here recounting the events of that fateful trip, I can't shake the image of the monster from my mind. The way it looked at me, that evil malevolence. I remember the ancient talisman that the ranger used to save me. I think about how naive we all were, and how we should have listened to the ranger's advice that first night. I thank God that he decided to come and check on the trail. I never did get an answer as to why he did that. What happened there will haunt me for the rest of my days. People still go missing there, and when I hear about another missing person, I can't forget the events of that trip. The only thing that I know is that I will never go back to Chippewa National Forest, or venture into any forest for that matter.